Every other pilot in Vietnam killed from a distance. The jet pilot released his payload at 10,000 feet, never seeing the impact. Artillery crews fired from miles away at grid references. Even B-52 crews at 30,000 feet simply pressed a button and turned back to base. The Cobra pilot saw faces. He flew 200 feet above the canopy at 170 miles per hour. When he pulled the trigger, he watched 4,000 rounds per minute tear human targets apart. Then he banked, circled back, and repeated the run. When the strike concluded, his command ordered him lower to count the remains. The AH-1 Cobra was the first helicopter built exclusively to kill, not to transport infantry, not to evacuate casualties, but to destroy. The aviators who operated it discovered that a machine designed purely for destruction alters the operator in ways no training can prepare for. This is that story. Here is the problem that created the Cobra. By 1965, the U.S. Army's core strategy relied heavily on air mobility. The AH-1 Huey, the defining symbol of the war, was inserting troops across the country.
Air cavalry, vertical envelopment, bypass the jungle, land behind enemy lines, fight on favorable terms. On paper, it was revolutionary. In practice, the transport Huey became a flying target. Viet Cong and NVA forces quickly adapted. They allowed the Hueys to commit to a landing zone, low, slow, maximally vulnerable, and opened fire from the tree line with heavy weapons. The transports carried door gunners with M60s, but a Huey on final approach presented an 8-foot-wide target doing 60 knots with its underside exposed. Helicopters were being downed faster than factories could build them. The Army attempted to weaponize the Huey itself, adding rocket pods, machine guns, and armor plating to create gunship variants called HOGs. These were meant to escort transports and suppress landing zones. However, adding heavy ordnance to a utility helicopter destroyed its speed. A loaded HOG could not keep up with the transports it was assigned to protect. It was wide, slow, and side-mounted weapons forced pilots to turn their broadside to the enemy to engage.
The military required a completely new design, not an armed transport, but an attack aircraft built from scratch. Bell Helicopter was already developing the concept. In September 1965, test pilot Bill Quinlan flew the Model 209 prototype for 12 minutes, altering military aviation permanently. Bell retained the Huey's engine, transmission, and rotor system, but wrapped them in a narrow fuselage, just 36 inches wide, a third of the Huey's width. The tandem cockpit placed the gunner in front and the pilot elevated behind him, presenting an extremely small target profile to ground fire. It reached top speeds of 220 miles per hour, featuring stub wings for rockets and a chin turret guided by the gunner's helmet movements. Wherever the gunner looked, the guns aimed. Less than 2 years after its first flight, 6 Cobras arrived at Bien Hoa Air Base on August 30, 1967. 5 days later, a Cobra crew scored its first confirmed kill against a Viet Cong sampan. By 1972, over 1,000 Cobras operated in Vietnam, logging over 1 million flight hours.
Yet its technical specs were not what made the Cobra terrifying. It was how it hunted. The deadliest tactic in the air war was the Pink Team. 1 light scout helicopter, an OH-6 Loach, and 1 Cobra. The Scout flew low-level reconnaissance, skimming 10 to 50 feet above the elephant grass, hunting for tracks, smoke, or enemy activity. Often, the Scout pilot intentionally drew ground fire to locate positions. The Cobra orbited 1,500 feet above. The moment the Scout took fire, the Scout pilot popped smoke to mark the target and broke away while the Cobra rolled into a dive. What followed took seconds. The Cobra pilot nosed down, accelerating into the attack run.
The gunner locked the turret onto the smoke signal. 2.75-inch folding fin aerial rockets hit the target area first, followed immediately by the minigun. The M134 minigun fired up to 4,000 rounds per minute, 67 rounds per second. The fire rate was so rapid the human ear could not distinguish individual shots. Veterans described it as the sound of tearing heavy fabric. Then the Cobra pulled up, orbited, and returned for another pass.
Unlike fast-moving jets, the Cobra loitered. It remained overhead, waiting for movement. NVA forces learned to dread the sound of its rotors. Enemy troops frequently refrained from firing at scout helicopters, specifically because they knew a Cobra was watching from above. Inside the cockpit, the engagement was intensely direct. The Cobra pilot operated at 200 feet, observing every strike up close. The gunner, positioned in the front seat, watched through his optics as rounds walked across the tree line. There was no distance or abstraction. Randy Zahn, a Cobra pilot who documented his experiences, described the psychological transition from an average teenager to a hardened combatant, noting the persistent internal conflict that accompanied engaging targets at eyeball level. After engagements, crews were routinely ordered to fly low over target areas to count body totals, a metric driven by institutional demands to track progress in a war with fixed front lines. Pilots were sent down to 50 feet to visually verify casualties, numbers that were frequently inflated up the chain of command. The young crews absorbed the psychological toll of these assignments. Some struggled after returning home, unable to process the intensity of their combat experiences. During the 1972 Easter Offensive, NVA forces deployed Soviet-supplied T-54 tanks. Cobras were not originally designed for anti-armor operations, but at the Battle of An Lac, crews engaged the armor directly using rockets and 20mm cannon fire, targeting tracks and optics to disable the vehicles. In one instance, Major Larry McKay and Warrant Officer Barry McIntyre destroyed a T-54's turret with a rocket strike, leading NVA crews to abandon their armor when Cobras appeared overhead. However, operating high-speed aircraft over dense canopy meant the boundary between combatants and civilians could be difficult to discern from the air.
Free fire policies designated specific zones as hostile, yet distinguishing between insurgents and local farmers wearing standard regional clothing presented constant challenges for flight crews. Operational losses were severe. Approximately 300 Cobras were destroyed and 247 crew members were killed over the course of the war. During Operation Lam Son 719 in early 1971, 26 Cobras were destroyed and 158 were damaged within an 8-week span. The AH-1 Cobra proved the viability of dedicated attack helicopters, establishing design principles, the narrow fuselage, tandem seating, and integrated chin turret that directly influenced modern platforms like the Apache, Viper, and Havoc. While the technology reshaped battlefield doctrine, the air crews who logged 1 million flight hours at treetop level carried the lasting weight of those missions long after their service concluded.